The shovel hit something solid 18 inches down, a sound that was distinctly not rock or root, something manufactured and deliberate that had no business being in the flower bed behind their new house. Lisa Chen stopped digging and looked at her husband, whose expression suggested he'd heard it too. They'd been working on the garden since morning, planning a perennial bed along the back fence, clearing away decades of weeds and neglect that had accumulated while the property sat vacant for 3 years. The previous owner had died without heirs. The house had gone through probate, and they'd bought it at auction for less than market value, precisely because it needed work. The garden was their first project, a way to put their stamp on the property before tackling interior renovations. Lisa had sketched designs, selected native plants that would thrive in partial shade, and spent 2 weekends hauling away debris and amending the soil. This back corner had been particularly overgrown, brambles and volunteers' trees that had taken root in the absence of maintenance. They'd cleared it down to bare earth, and now, 3 feet from the fence line, her shovel had struck something that rang with metallic resonance. James knelt beside the hole and brushed away loose dirt, revealing the edge of what appeared to be a metal box, roughly the size of a large toolbox, buried deliberately with its top facing upward. The metal was rusted but intact, with no visible lock or latch, just a seam running around the perimeter suggesting a lid that could be pried open. They looked at each other with a mixture of excitement and apprehension, both thinking the same thing. People don't bury boxes in their gardens unless they're hiding something. James said they should dig it out carefully, document everything, be methodical about this in case they'd stumbled onto something significant. Lisa agreed, though part of her wanted to pry it open immediately to satisfy the curiosity that had been building since that first metallic ring. They spent the next 20 minutes excavating around the box, working carefully to avoid damaging whatever it contained until they could lift it free from the earth. It was heavier than expected, perhaps 40 pounds, the weight distributed evenly, suggesting contents that were packed carefully rather than thrown in hastily. They carried it to the patio, set it on the picnic table they'd bought the week before, and stood staring at it, both hesitant to take the next step. Whatever was inside had been buried for years, possibly decades, based on the rust, and once they opened it, they'd be responsible for whatever knowledge came spilling out. Before we reveal what was in that box and why it had been buried in their garden, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss the rest of this story. Drop a like if you're already hooked, and leave a comment telling me what country and city you're watching from. I love seeing how our community spans the globe, connecting people through stories that remind us how secrets have a way of surfacing no matter how deeply they're buried. There's something primal about digging in earth, about turning soil and planting things, connecting with land in ways that feel ancient and fundamental. Lisa and James had been looking forward to this project, to creating something beautiful from neglect, to watching seeds become flowers, to having a space where they could sit on summer evenings and feel like they'd accomplished something tangible. They'd met in college, married young, spent their 20s in apartments saving money, and this house represented a milestone, proof they were building the life they'd imagined. It wasn't a grand house, just a 1950s ranch in an older neighborhood where trees lined the streets and houses needed work but had good bones. The garden had sold Lisa on the property, 1/3 of an acre, mostly flat, with mature oaks providing shade and a back fence ensuring privacy. She'd walked the perimeter during their first showing, ignoring the realtor's pitch about square footage and updated kitchens, instead imagining where she'd put raised beds for vegetables, where the flowers would go, how she'd restore what had clearly once been someone's pride. The previous owner, a man named Harold Brennan, had lived in the house for 47 years before his death at 89. The neighbors said he'd been a gardener, that the yard had been spectacular before his health declined, that he'd won neighborhood beautification awards in the 70s and 80s. By the time of his death, though, everything had gone to seed. His final decade marked by increasing frailty and decreasing ability to maintain what he'd built. Lisa and James had seen the neglect as opportunity, a chance to restore rather than starting from scratch, to honor what Brennan had created while making it their own. The box sat between them on the picnic table, rust flaking onto the wood surface, waiting to be opened. James retrieved a screwdriver and a hammer from the garage, tools that might help pry the lid if it was sealed tight by corrosion. He worked the screwdriver under the lid's edge, tapping gently with the hammer, loosening decades of rust and compression. The seal finally broke with a groan of metal on metal, and the lid lifted enough for James to get his fingers underneath and pull it fully open. The contents were wrapped in oilcloth, brown with age but intact, protecting whatever lay beneath from moisture and decay. Lisa carefully unfolded the cloth, revealing stacks of papers, yellowed but readable, covered in handwriting. Beneath the papers were photographs, dozens of them, black and white images from what appeared to be the 1950s and 60s. And beneath the photographs, wrapped in a separate piece of cloth, was a leather journal, its cover worn, but its pages preserved. They spread everything on the table, handling each item carefully, trying to understand what they were looking at. The papers appeared to be letters, written in the same neat handwriting, all addressed to my dearest Margaret, and signed, "Forever yours, Harold." The photographs showed a young couple, a man who was clearly a younger version of Harold Brennan, based on the resemblance to an old photo they'd found hanging in the house's hallway, and a woman with dark hair and a smile that seemed to light up every image. They were photographed at beaches, at parks, in front of the house, always together, always touching, the kind of photographs that documented deep connection. Lisa opened the journal and read the first entry, dated May 3rd, 1956. "Margaret and I were married today in secret. Her family will never approve, would never accept me, so we've decided to build a life hidden from them, to be together in the only way we can. This house will be our sanctuary, this garden our testimony to what we've created together." Lisa read the entry aloud to James, and they exchanged looks of confusion. The neighbors had said Harold Brennan lived alone, had been a bachelor his entire life, had no family beyond a distant cousin who'd inherited the estate. But this journal told a different story, spoke of a marriage, of a woman named Margaret, of a life shared. Lisa flipped through the journal, scanning entries that spanned decades. May 1956 through December 1989, regular entries documenting daily life, garden plans, shared dreams, and eventually, tragedy. She found an entry from 1989 that made her stop reading and look up at James with tears in her eyes. "Margaret died today. The cancer finally took her. We had 33 years together, every moment stolen from the world that would have kept us apart. No one can ever know. Her family thinks she died a spinster, living across town in the apartment she maintained as cover. They'll bury her there, and I'll bury her memory here, in the garden we created, in the house we shared, in the secret we protected. The world will never know what we meant to each other, but the garden will remember. Every flower I plant will be a testament to her, to us, to love that existed in hiding because the world was too small to accept it." Lisa explained to James what she'd found, the revelation settling between them. Harold Brennan had been married to Margaret for 33 years, but their relationship had been secret, hidden from a world that apparently wouldn't have accepted it. The reason became clear as Lisa read more entries, as the context emerged from Harold's careful documentation. Margaret's family had been prominent, wealthy, socially conservative in ways that made her relationship with Harold impossible to acknowledge publicly. He'd been working class, from a different background, and their relationship had violated the social boundaries her family enforced rigidly. Rather than give each other up, they'd created an elaborate deception. Margaret maintained an apartment across town, appeared at family functions alone, lived a public life of respectable spinsterhood while secretly sharing this house with Harold, sharing a marriage that existed only between them and in this garden they'd cultivated together. The letters reinforced what the journal revealed: correspondence between Harold and Margaret, written during the brief periods when they had to be apart, when family obligations pulled Margaret back to her public life and her maintained fiction. The letters were tender, detailed, full of longing and reassurance, promising that the separation was temporary, that they'd be together again soon, that their secret life was worth the complications of maintaining it. James found a letter dated 1987 that mentioned Margaret's diagnosis, her decision to keep even that secret from her family, her determination to spend her remaining time in the house with Harold rather than in hospitals surrounded by relatives who didn't know the truth. She died here, in the bedroom that Lisa and James now occupied, cared for by Harold alone, her passing known only to him and documented only in his private journal. They spent hours going through the contents of the box, piecing together a story of hidden love and elaborate deception, of two people who'd chosen each other over the approval of family and society, who'd built a life that existed in the gaps between public performance and private reality. The photographs showed a progression over decades: young couple in the 50s, middle-aged couple in the 70s, aging couple in the 80s, always in this garden, always together, documenting moments that could never be displayed publicly. The final photograph in the collection showed Harold and Margaret, both clearly elderly, sitting on a bench that Lisa recognized as still being in the garden, positioned under an oak tree. They were holding hands, looking at each other rather than at the camera, which must have been set on a timer. On the back, in Harold's handwriting, "Our last photograph together, taken 3 days before Margaret left me. 33 years of happiness, stolen from a world that would have denied us. I regret nothing except that we couldn't be open, that she had to maintain the fiction until her death, that even her grave will carry her maiden name and list her as unmarried. But we knew the truth, and that was enough." Lisa wiped tears from her face as she read the inscription, understanding now why Harold had buried this box, why he'd kept the secret even after Margaret's death. Her family had never known, had buried her across town with a gravestone that erased Harold's existence, and he'd let them, had maintained the fiction one final time to avoid the scandal that would have erupted if the truth emerged. He'd lived alone in this house for 27 years after Margaret's death, tending the garden they'd created, keeping their secret until his own death at 89. The neighbors thought he'd been a bachelor, a solitary man devoted to his flowers. They had no idea he'd been a widower, grieving a wife the world had never acknowledged. James suggested they should try to find Margaret's family, should tell them the truth, should give her the recognition she'd been denied. But Lisa pointed out that Margaret and Harold had chosen secrecy, had maintained the fiction deliberately, and maybe their choice should be respected even now. They discussed options, debated obligations, tried to figure out what honor demanded in a situation this complicated. Finally, they decided on a compromise. They'd preserve the box and its contents, would document the story properly, but would also respect the privacy Harold and Margaret had fought to maintain. They'd contact a local historical society, would donate the materials with the understanding that they documented a secret marriage and should be handled with sensitivity to the people involved. They'd create a proper memorial in the garden, something that acknowledged what this place had meant to two people who'd loved each other in a time and place that made that love something to hide. Lisa designed a memorial garden in the back corner where they'd found the box, planted flowers that would bloom from spring through fall, installed a bench with a small plaque that read, "In memory of love that flourished in secret," and a garden that kept the secret faithfully. They didn't include names, didn't provide details that would invite speculation, just acknowledged that something significant had happened here, that this ground was sacred in ways most people would never understand. The Historical Society was grateful for the donation, confirmed that they'd preserve the materials properly and make them available to researchers while respecting the sensitivity of the story. A volunteer who specialized in local history did additional research and discovered that Margaret's family had indeed been prominent, that social dynamics of the 1950s would have made her relationship with Harold scandalous, that the deception they'd maintained had been necessary given the context in which they'd lived. She found Margaret's grave in a cemetery across town, a simple stone with her maiden name and dates, no mention of marriage or relationship, the public record erasing the most important part of her life. Lisa and James visited the grave, brought flowers from their garden, stood silently acknowledging a woman they'd never met but whose home they now occupied. They felt connected to her, to Harold, to the life that had unfolded in the spaces they now inhabited. They finished planting their garden, creating new beds and restoring old ones, always conscious that they were building on foundation laid by people who'd loved this land for reasons both practical and profound. The memorial corner became Lisa's favorite spot, the place she sat on summer evenings thinking about the box they'd unearthed, about the lives that had played out hidden from public view, about how much courage it must have taken to choose love over approval, secrecy over recognition. She thought about all the other secrets that might be buried in gardens and attics and storage units across the world, stories that existed only in the memories of people who'd lived them, and the occasional evidence they'd left behind for strangers to find. Neighbors started asking about the memorial, curious about the plaque and the carefully tended flowers that seemed distinct from the rest of the garden. Lisa and James developed a simple explanation. It honored the previous owner, a man who'd loved this garden and poured his life into its creation. That was true, if incomplete, and it satisfied curiosity without betraying the trust Harold had placed in secrecy. Months passed, seasons changed, the garden cycled through its patterns of growth and dormancy. Lisa and James settled into the house, made it theirs while respecting what it had been, lived their lives openly in spaces that had once sheltered hidden love. They thought often about Harold and Margaret, about the parallels and differences between their own relationship and the one that had existed here before. Lisa and James had married publicly, had celebrated with family and friends, had legal recognition and social acceptance of their relationship. Harold and Margaret had been denied all of that, had built their life in the shadows of social disapproval, had accepted secrecy as the price of being together. The contrast made Lisa grateful for the progress that had been made, for the ways the world had changed, while also honoring the courage it had taken for two people to create happiness under conditions that denied them the basic right to acknowledge each other publicly. One evening in late summer, Lisa was working in the memorial corner, deadheading flowers and pulling weeds, when an elderly woman approached from the sidewalk. She introduced herself as Dorothy Chen, said she'd grown up 3 houses down in the 1960s, had known Harold Brennan when she was young. She'd heard from neighbors that Lisa and James had found something in the garden, something significant, and she wanted to share information she'd kept to herself for decades. Dorothy said that as a teenager, she'd sometimes seen a woman at Harold's house, brief glimpses through windows, a figure in the garden early in the morning before the neighborhood was awake. She'd mentioned it once to her parents, who'd told her strictly to never speak of it, that some things were private and not her business. She'd honored that instruction for 50 years, but now, hearing that Lisa and James knew about Margaret, she wanted to confirm that the woman had been real, that Dorothy's teenage observations hadn't been imagination or mistake. Lisa invited Dorothy to sit on the memorial bench and told her yes, Margaret had been real, had been Harold's wife for 33 years, had lived in this house and tended this garden, and existed in a secret that only a few people had ever glimpsed. Dorothy wept, said she'd always wondered, had carried the memory of that woman's face for decades, had sometimes doubted her own recollection. Knowing it was real, that she'd witnessed something true, even if she hadn't understood it at the time, brought her a closure she hadn't known she needed. She shared details Lisa hadn't known, that Harold had been kind to neighborhood children, had given them vegetables from his garden, had been generous and warm despite the isolation his secret required. She said that in the months after Margaret's death, Harold had seemed diminished. His garden had begun its slow decline, but he'd continued tending the memorial corner, the area where Lisa now sat, with particular devotion. Dorothy believed that was where Margaret's presence was strongest for him, where he felt closest to her memory. Lisa showed Dorothy photographs from the box, images of Harold and Margaret young and in love, and Dorothy confirmed that was the woman she'd seen. That face matched the glimpses she'd caught through windows all those years ago. They sat together in the memorial garden as evening deepened, two women separated by a generation, but connected through the secret they now shared, the knowledge of love that had existed despite the world's rejection. Dorothy said she was glad someone knew the full story now, glad the house had passed to people who would honor it rather than erase it, glad that Harold and Margaret's life together wouldn't be completely forgotten. She promised to visit again, to share more memories of Harold in his later years, to help Lisa understand the man who'd lived here before. As Dorothy left, Lisa sat alone on the bench, surrounded by flowers blooming in the space where a metal box had been buried, where evidence of hidden love had waited in darkness until curious gardeners had uncovered it. She thought about the responsibility that came with knowledge, about how finding secrets meant becoming their keeper, about how the past was never truly past, but always present in the spaces we inhabited and the stories we chose to remember or forget. She and James had uncovered a secret buried forever, or at least intended to be, and in uncovering it, they'd been given the task of deciding what forever meant, whether secrets should stay buried or whether love deserved acknowledgement even decades after the people who'd lived it had died. They chose acknowledgement, carefully bounded by respect for privacy, creating a memorial that honored without exposing, that recognized without exploiting, that preserved the story while protecting the people who'd lived it. The garden became their shared project, with two ghosts, Lisa and James, building on foundation that Harold and Margaret had laid, continuing the work of creating beauty from earth, of making things grow in spaces that had known both joy and sorrow. Every time Lisa planted a new flower, she thought about the ones Harold had planted, about how gardens were living memorials, about how the perennials he'd chosen in the 1950s and 60s still emerged each spring, still bloomed, still testified to his presence decades after his death. She wondered if he'd known, when he buried that box, that someone would eventually find it, that the secret would emerge, that his love for Margaret would finally be acknowledged by strangers who would become the unexpected keepers of their story. She hoped he'd be satisfied with what they'd done, with the memorial they'd created, with the care they'd taken to honor what he and Margaret had shared while respecting the boundaries they'd maintained. The garden flourished under Lisa and James's stewardship, became known in the neighborhood for its beauty, won the same awards Harold had won decades before. Visitors would comment on the memorial corner, would read the plaque, would ask what it commemorated. And Lisa would smile and say it honored love that had grown in secret, a story of two people who'd built a life hidden from the world, who'd created beauty together in a garden that still remembered them, still testified to what they'd meant to each other, still bloomed with flowers planted by hands that had loved each other across decades of deliberate obscurity. They'd been planting flowers when they uncovered the secret buried forever, and now they were planting flowers that would keep that secret alive, that would ensure Harold and Margaret's love continued blooming long after everyone who'd known them personally had died. The garden would remember, the flowers would testify, and the secret that had been buried would live on in the earth, in the roots that spread beneath the surface, in the blooms that emerged each spring, to prove that what's planted with love never truly dies, but transforms into new life, new beauty, new testimony to the human capacity to create meaning, even under conditions that deny us recognition, acceptance, or the simple right to love openly.